We're watching something dangerous unfold in real time, and most Americans have no idea it's happening. The United States just closed its airspace to Venezuelan aircraft, a move that sounds bureaucratic, maybe even justified. But here's what they're not telling you. This isn't about safety or sanctions compliance. This is about backing a government into a corner, squeezing them economically, isolating them diplomatically, and daring them to respond. And Venezuela isn't standing alone. Russia has deep military ties there. Cuba depends on Venezuelan oil to keep its lights on. Iran has been building strategic partnerships across Latin America for years. So the question isn't whether this airspace closure matters. It's whether we just triggered a response we're not prepared for. Are we looking at coordinated pushback? Could Russia move more military assets into the region? Will Iran accelerate weapons transfers or intelligence sharing? These aren't hypothetical scenarios. They're logical consequences of a policy that treats sovereignty like a bargaining chip. We've done this before, and it never ends the way Washington promises it will. The Venezuela airspace crisis isn't just about one country. It's about what happens when you push multiple powers simultaneously and assume none of them will push back. Let me be very direct with you about what's happening here, because the framing you're getting from mainstream media and official Washington statements is incomplete at best and deliberately misleading at worst. When the United States closes its airspace to Venezuelan aircraft, the immediate reaction from most Americans is probably something like, well, Venezuela is under sanctions. This makes sense. This is just enforcement. But that surface level reading misses the entire geopolitical chess game that's been playing out in our hemisphere for decades. And it certainly misses the very real possibility that we're about to see consequences that nobody in Washington seems to have seriously wargamed. Let's start with the basics, because context matters enormously here. Venezuela sits on the largest proven oil reserves in the world, larger than Saudi Arabia, larger than Russia. We're talking about hundreds of billions of barrels of crude oil. And for years, American policy toward Venezuela has been shaped by the reality of those resources and who controls them. When Hugo Chavez came to power and started nationalizing oil assets, redirecting revenues towards social programs, and building alliances with countries Washington considered adversaries, that's when Venezuela went from being just another Latin American country to being a target. And I want to be clear about something. You can criticize Chavez's economic policies. You can point to mismanagement and corruption under Maduro. You can acknowledge the genuine suffering of the Venezuelan people, and all of that can be true while also recognizing that U.S. policy toward Venezuela has never primarily been about human rights or democracy. It's been about control, access, and preventing the emergence of an independent pole of power in Latin America. The airspace closure needs to be understood in that context. This isn't happening in isolation. This is part of a sustained campaign of economic warfare that includes sanctions on Venezuelan oil exports, seizure of Venezuelan assets held in American banks, recognition of an opposition figure as the legitimate president, even though he never won an election and never controlled the country, and consistent diplomatic efforts to isolate Venezuela internationally. Every one of these measures is designed to create economic pain, destabilize the government, and ideally produce regime change. And here's where it gets complicated, because regime change operations rarely work the way their architects imagine, and they almost always produce unintended consequences that end up making the situation worse for everyone involved. Now, why does this airspace closure matter more than previous sanctions? Because it's not just symbolic, it's operational. It affects Venezuela's ability to conduct international flights, to maintain diplomatic connections, to move people and goods. It's another turn of the screw, another layer of isolation. And more importantly, it sends a signal to Venezuela and its allies that the United States is willing to keep escalating, keep tightening the noose, keep pushing. And that signal doesn't just get received in Caracas, it gets received in Moscow and Havana, in Tehran. Those capitals are watching very carefully, because what happens to Venezuela has implications for all of them. Let's talk about Russia first, because the Russia-Venezuela relationship is far deeper than most Americans realize. Russia has billions of dollars invested in Venezuelan oil infrastructure. Rosneft, the Russian state oil company, has been a major player in Venezuela for years. Russia has also sold Venezuela military equipment, We're talking about air defense systems, fighter jets, helicopters, small arms. Russian military advisors have been on the ground in Venezuela. There have been joint military exercises. Russian strategic bombers have flown to Venezuela for training missions, just to make a point about power projection. So when the United States escalates pressure on Venezuela, Russia doesn't see that as just a regional issue. Russia sees that as pressure on Russian investments, Russian strategic interests, and Russian allies. And given everything that's happening right now with Ukraine, with NATO expansion, with Western sanctions on Russia, Moscow is already in a confrontational posture with Washington. The idea that Russia would simply absorb another American power play in its sphere of influence without responding is naive. What could a Russian response look like? Well, there are options that fall short of direct military confrontation but still send a clear message. Russia could increase military aid to Venezuela. Not just equipment sales, but actual deployed systems, more sophisticated air defense, electronic warfare capabilities, intelligence sharing infrastructure. Russia could deploy more military personnel to Venezuela as advisors, technicians, trainers. Russia could expand its naval presence in the Caribbean, something it's done periodically just to remind Washington that the Monroe Doctrine is not a law of nature. Russia could also work through multilateral channels, using its position in the United Nations and other international bodies to challenge U.S. sanctions regimes and airspace closures as violations of international law. And let's be honest, Russia would have a point. If we're going to talk about respecting sovereignty and international norms, then unilateral American sanctions and airspace closures against countries we don't like are not exactly consistent with those principles. Then there's Cuba, and this is where the picture gets even more interconnected. Cuba depends on Venezuelan oil. For years, Venezuela has been sending subsidized oil to Cuba, essentially keeping the Cuban economy afloat. That relationship isn't just economic, it's ideological and historical. Cuba and Venezuela see themselves as part of the same project: Latin American independence from U.S. hegemony, socialist governance models, resistance to imperialism. When the United States pressures Venezuela, it's indirectly pressuring Cuba, because if Venezuela's economy collapses or if a pro-American government takes power in Caracas, Cuba loses its lifeline. So Cuba has every incentive to help Venezuela resist American pressure, and Cuba has decades of experience doing exactly that. What can Cuba do? Cuba can provide intelligence support, diplomatic backing, propaganda, and information warfare capabilities. Cuban doctors and technical experts have been working in Venezuela for years, and that presence helps Venezuela maintain basic services despite economic collapse. Cuba can also serve as a diplomatic bridge, connecting Venezuela to other countries in Latin America and beyond who are skeptical of U.S. policy. And don't underestimate Cuba's symbolic importance. If Cuba and Venezuela can survive sustained American pressure, that sends a message to every other country in the region that independence from Washington is possible. That's a message the United States has spent decades trying to suppress, and it's exactly the message that Cuba and Venezuela want to amplify. Now let's bring Iran into the picture, because Iran's involvement with Venezuela is one of the most underreported and misunderstood aspects of this entire situation. Iran and Venezuela have been building ties for years, and those ties are based on a shared experience of being targeted by American sanctions and a shared interest in creating alternative power structures that don't depend on Washington's approval. Iran has helped Venezuela with oil refining technology because Venezuelan crude is heavy and requires specialized refining, and U.S. sanctions have made it difficult for Venezuela to access that technology through traditional channels. Iran has also reportedly helped Venezuela evade sanctions by facilitating oil sales, providing shipping and logistics support, and creating financial workarounds that bypass the U.S.-dominated international banking system. But Iran's interest in Venezuela goes beyond just economics. For Iran, having a presence in Latin America is strategic. It's about demonstrating reach, about showing that Iran can operate in America's backyard just as America operates in Iran's neighborhood. It's about building leverage. If the United States escalates against Venezuela, Iran could deepen its involvement, more technical support, more sanctions evasion assistance, potentially even military cooperation. And here's what should worry American policymakers. Iran has experience building proxy relationships, supplying asymmetric warfare capabilities, and supporting allies who are under pressure from superior conventional forces. If Iran decides to really invest in helping Venezuela resist American pressure, that could mean training, intelligence, weapons systems, and strategic advice that makes Venezuela much harder to isolate or destabilize. So now you have this situation where a U.S. airspace closure, something that might seem like a minor administrative action, is actually another escalation in a multi-decade conflict. And that escalation is being closely watched by three countries that have their own reasons to push back against American power. And here's the thing that I think Washington consistently fails to understand. When you pressure multiple countries simultaneously, when you treat every country that doesn't follow American leadership as an enemy that needs to be sanctioned and isolated, you create incentives for those countries to work together. You create a coalition of resistance. Russia, Cuba, Iran, and Venezuela don't have identical ideologies or identical interests, but they share one very important characteristic. They're all targets of American pressure, and they all benefit from cooperating to reduce their vulnerability to that pressure. This is where I have to talk about the broader pattern, because Venezuela is not unique. This is the same playbook the United States has used over and over again. Economic sanctions, diplomatic isolation, support for opposition groups, recognition of alternative governments, and if all else fails, military intervention either directly or through proxies. We've seen this in Iraq, in Libya, in Syria, in Iran, in Cuba, in Nicaragua, and now in Venezuela. And the track record is not good. Iraq descended into sectarian violence and created the conditions for ISIS. Libya became a failed state with open-air slave markets and warring militias. Syria has been devastated by civil war. Iran's government has become more hardline and more entrenched. Cuba has survived decades of sanctions without changing its system. So when I see the same pattern being applied to Venezuela, my first question is, what makes anyone think this time will be different? And the human cost of these policies is enormous, and that needs to be said clearly. When you sanction a country's economy, when you freeze its assets, when you prevent it from trading, you're not just hurting the government, you're hurting ordinary people. In Venezuela, we've seen malnutrition, medical supply shortages, hyperinflation, massive emigration. Millions of Venezuelans have fled the country. And yes, the Maduro government's economic policies have contributed to that crisis, but U.S. sanctions have made it dramatically worse. There are studies showing that tens of thousands of people have died because of sanctions-related shortages of medicine and food. That's not hypothetical. That's documented. And yet the sanctions continue, and now we're escalating further with airspace closures. What's the end game here? That's the question I keep coming back to. Is the goal regime change? If so, what comes after Maduro? Who takes power? Will that government be stable? Will it be democratic? Or will we see the same kind of chaos and violence that followed regime change in Iraq and Libya? Is the goal to seize control of Venezuelan oil? If so, how exactly does that work in the 21st century? You can't just invade a country and take its resources anymore, not without massive international backlash and long-term insurgency. Is the goal simply to punish Venezuela for defying American leadership? Because if that's the goal, it's working, but it's also creating exactly the kind of anti-American coalition that makes the world more dangerous and more unstable. Here's what I think is actually happening, and this is where the risk of escalation becomes very real. The United States is operating on autopilot. We have a foreign policy establishment that views any challenge to American primacy as intolerable, and the default response to that challenge is pressure, sanctions, isolation, and if necessary, force. There's very little strategic thinking about whether these policies actually serve American interests in the long term. There's very little consideration of unintended consequences. There's very little willingness to engage in diplomacy or compromise. And because of that, we keep escalating, we keep pushing, and eventually somebody pushes back. If Russia sends advanced military systems to Venezuela, how does the United States respond? Do we accept that as Russia exercising its own sovereign right to support an ally, or do we treat that as an intolerable provocation? If Iran increases its presence in Venezuela, do we launch a new round of sanctions, or do we start talking about military options? If Cuba deepens its support for Venezuela and that contributes to the Maduro government's survival, do we accept that outcome or do we escalate against Cuba as well? These are not abstract questions. These are the decisions that will need to be made in the coming months. And right now, I don't see evidence that anyone in Washington is seriously thinking through the implications. The Venezuela airspace crisis is a test case for a much larger question about American foreign policy. Can we move beyond regime change and economic warfare as our primary tools? Can we accept a multipolar world where not every country aligns with Washington? Can we engage in genuine diplomacy that respects other countries' sovereignty and seeks mutually beneficial outcomes rather than domination? Or are we going to keep doing the same thing over and over again, expecting different results and blaming everyone else when those results don't materialize? I want to be clear about something because I know how these conversations usually go. Criticizing U.S. policy toward Venezuela does not mean endorsing the Maduro government. You can believe that Maduro has governed badly and that the Venezuelan people deserve better, while also believing that American sanctions and airspace closures are counterproductive and morally wrong. You can believe that Russia, Cuba, and Iran are pursuing their own interests and are not innocent actors, while also believing that the United States is pursuing its own interests in ways that violate international law and cause immense human suffering. The world is complicated. Foreign policy requires nuance, and right now nuance is in very short supply in Washington. So will Russia, Cuba, and Iran strike back? I think the answer is yes, they already are, and they will continue to do so in ways that are calibrated to avoid direct confrontation with the United States, but still defend their interests and support their ally. That means more military aid, more economic support, more sanctions evasion, more diplomatic backing, and more efforts to build alternative international structures that reduce dependence on U.S.-dominated systems. And every time the United States escalates, every time we close more airspace or impose more sanctions or make more threats, we strengthen the incentives for those countries to work together and push back harder. That's the dynamic we've created, and unless we change course, it's the dynamic that will define this conflict for years to come. The question is whether we have the wisdom to step back from this path before the consequences become even more severe than they already are.